Thank you, Roger Beverly Shea. I don't believe in luck, and I'm glad that I don't, because if I believed in it, I would also be confident that I have none. Maybe you were in the same category. Let me give you an example of that. This what I'm describing seems to regularly be on display. Anytime I go to one of the larger stores, something like a Costco or a Harris Teeter or a Walmart or something like that, where there's a lot of checkout possibilities. And so anyway, you've been through the store, you've done the shopping that you want to do, and so you've got stuff in your bug. You head out or head up to the front of the store where the cash registers are so that you can check out. And once you get up there, even though you've never had calculus, you're doing some calculus, right? And what's the calculus? Which line is fastest? And so one of the first things that you do is to see how many people are in a line, but you can't just decide which line you're going to go in as far as which one you think is fastest based on the number of people that are in the line, because one person might have, or two people might have just buggy filled with stuff, and then others just have a loaf of bread or something like that. So you're making some assessments based on the number of people, based on how many items they have in their cart. Sometimes you're looking at the cash register or the cashier and you're thinking, I wonder how fast Grandma Moses is on this cash register. She's looking kind of slow. I think I'm going to go in that. Anyway, so you're making all of these observations, conducting all these assessments, trying to decide which line is fastest. So I make that decision. And so I've cast my lot and I get in line whatever. And so I'm standing there and then other people come in behind me, but I can't stop the assessment. I start looking over at the other lines, especially if they're close. Thinking, maybe, I tell you what, I'm going to switch. I'm going to go to this one. And so when I do that, I have given that spot now to someone else. And even then, the assessment continues, because I'm comparing how am I doing now compared to what I would have been doing. Do you do this? Anyway, so I'm doing that. And invariably, when I do that, everything in the line that I am in comes to a screeching halt. The cash register runs out of receipt paper. There is a price check necessary on some sort of item. There's anybody that writes a check somehow gets in front of me, and they never even dig for their checkbook until they hear a total. That's frustrating. If you do that, you need to repent of that today. Actually, quit using checks. Anyway, if it's not that, it's somebody that's going to pay for their item in nickels in their lane. And whatever it is, it's just taking forever. And then I see where I would have been, and I watch that person as they leave the store, and I feel like they're doing this to me. Loser, as I'm still standing in line. Why? Because I gave that spot away. I gave that spot to someone else. And every time I do that, it seems that it never works out well for me. You know, on the spiritual level, I believe sincerely that there's application for us in that. And what I mean is this. I believe that in every person that has or will ever live, that has walked on this earth, that is walking on this earth, there is a piece of me that a part of me that is perfectly spaced, that is made by God for His spot in my life. I mean, Solomon described it this way, that God has put eternity in our hearts. And we've heard it before, that there's this God-shaped vacuum in the heart of every person. I believe that to be the case, but I also believe it is the case that many times what we will do is give that spot away. We'll allow something or someone other than God into that spot. We have been, and we're continuing to think about that through the lens of a series that we're calling Here Are Your Idols. And very easily we could say, we know that the Ten Commandments say not to have any graven images. There's no way that, I don't have some statue in my yard. I don't have some gnome in my home that what's a nice rhyme? A gnome in my home. Anyway, so I don't have something that I'm bowing down to, but the reality is you could be seated here in a Christian church as part of a worship service, but in truth, what could have happened is that you've given God's spot to something else. And one of the things that ensnares a lot of people, even folks that say that they have a relationship with Christ, that are part of the team, is stuff. They will give things. They will give money. They'll give the stuff of life. They'll give that God's place. And let me just tell you, anytime we do that, it never works out well. But why in the world would I say that? Just because it's conjecture? No, because I believe it's actually the case. And there are actual consequences when we give material things God's place in our life. And that's what we want to think about this morning. In fact, that's the specific question we want to answer. What are the consequences of giving material things God's place in your life? Look with me as we see Jesus giving us the answer to that as part of the Sermon on the Mount in Matthew chapter 6. Matthew chapter 6. Just a couple of verses here, starting in verse 19. Jesus says this, "Don't store up for yourselves treasures on earth where moth and rust destroy and where thieves break in and steal. But store up for yourselves treasures in heaven where neither moth nor rust destroys and where thieves don't break in and steal. For where your treasure is, there your heart will be also." Now, there's a lot of things that Jesus talks about in the Sermon on the Mount, and in this one particular section, he's talking about materialism. He's talking about the stuff of life. And ultimately, I believe what he is communicating helps answer this question for us as to what are the consequences if I give God's place in my life, what the spot that he should have in my life. What happens instead of giving God that? I put stuff in there. I put money. I put property. I put investments. I put my home, I put my car, I put some sort of stuff in there. What are the consequences of that? Based on what Jesus says, I believe the first consequence is this. You risk losing what matters most. You risk losing what matters most. When Jesus starts this statement in verse 19 where he says, "Don't store up for yourselves treasures on earth," it's possible to take this to a position or to an extreme that Jesus was not arguing for. He was not suggesting that you should not make plans whatsoever for the future and that you ought not have a bank account that has any money in it. Because we say that for a couple of reasons. There are a number of instances, specifically some of the individuals in the Old Testament like Abraham and Solomon and David that possessed inordinate amounts of wealth. Beyond that, we have the Bible calling us to even consider the ant. It says, "Consider the ant, you sluggard," and talking about how even bugs, ants, store and set away and set aside for the future. It is the case that we should do that. And there ought to be something that in the event that something happens, I have some sort of tragedy, I have some sort of calamity, something breaks, that I have the wherewithal to fix it. That's being prudent. That's being wise. What Jesus, I believe, is talking about is taking it not just a step further, but many steps further, such that you are thinking about, in fact, you become absorbed by thinking about your stuff. Ultimately, I believe the principle is this. You should govern your treasures, but you shouldn't be governed by your treasures. You should govern your stuff, not be governed by your stuff. And that, I believe, is what Jesus is prohibiting here. And he says, if you do that, if you're governed by stuff, and if you've given God's place to stuff, material things, to money, to possessions in your life, there are some real consequences. And the first thing that he describes is that it can be lost, and he gives several illustrations of that. The first thing that he talks about is a moth. And I don't know if you've thought much about moths. I probably have thought more about them than probably I should, but that is one dumb bug, isn't it? I mean, when there's a light bulb, I think I will beat my head against it. What are they thinking? Like when they get there? I mean, I don't know. Anyway, but among the things that moths do is that they go to light, but there's something else they do. They eat wool. Maybe you've had garments that have been destroyed, had stacks of little holes eaten them by these silly little bugs. Now, it is the case now, but it was especially the case in the first century when Jesus was writing, or when he was speaking these things, and this was being written down, that clothes were particularly important because they were especially expensive. I mean, we have all kinds of machines and we have all sorts of technology that enables us to make clothing quite cheaply, but in the first century, that was not the case. And so clothing was quite expensive, and you would have had just an outfit or two, and it would have been probably fairly plain. And if you had something that was particularly colorful or nice, man, that would have been an expensive item that you would have possessed in the first century. And Jesus is talking to people that understood that clothes could be particularly important to them, could be particularly valuable to them. And he says what? You can have this item, and what might happen? A bug could eat it. A moth could effectively ruin this that you deem to be so valuable. So the encouragement is if it's maybe not in the same way that it was then, but I mean, the reality is still today, there are plenty of people that are clothes hounds, aren't they? Some people should be greater clothes hounds and maybe wear more clothes than they should, but it's entirely possible to be just so assumed or consumed by having another outfit and another dress, another shirt, another pair of pants, another jacket, another whatever, that we get so consumed by these. And Jesus says that stuff that you can be chasing, a bug could ruin it. Beyond that, he talks about rust. Now, obviously, rust is going to be the enemy of metal. And in the first century, the types of things that he could be describing that would be affected by rust, maybe it was some particularly fine utensils. Maybe it was some fine tool. Maybe it was some elaborate metal decoration. But you could have that item, and sheer exposure to the elements, just to the air, to the moisture that's in the air, over time, that thing could just disintegrate. If you want to see that happen very quickly, go to the beach, right? I mean, you just see all kinds of stuff, that salt air just consuming something that otherwise could have been quite valuable. Now, in the first century, maybe it was some pricey tool or utensil. In the 21st century, maybe it's a car. But regardless, the illustration that he's appealing to is that maybe there's some metal something that you value, that you put, I mean, that's what you're consumed by. If that is the case, just it being exposed to the air could cause it to be lost. So bugs can eat it, air can destroy it. Well, and if that doesn't get it, then Jesus says maybe there's something else that you prize, something else that you deem to be particularly valuable, and what can happen? The boogeyman can get it, right? Thieves can break in and steal, and they can steal things that really matter, things that are heirlooms, things that are priceless, things that are one of a kind, things that really matter to you. Jesus says all of that stuff can be taken. Ultimately, I believe what he is describing is this, that the things that matter most to you, if they are things that are in this world, they are subject to being lost. And what needs to matter most to you, especially as one that professes to have a relationship with the Lord, is that which is not in this world. In fact, the one that made the world. If you give God's place in your life to stuff, Jesus is very pointed and clear in communicating this. You can lose it. In one form or fashion, it can be gone. And that which you deem to be so valuable, that so matters to you, it can be gone. A storm could take it. A thief could take it. The air could take it. A bug could take it. Anything could take it. Not long ago, I had been to a music store over in Burlington. It's called Low Vintage, and they sell, it's stringed instruments, so guitars, banjos, mandolins, mostly those things. Anyway, stack of guitars and stuff. But most of the stuff they have in there is fairly expensive. In fact, some of the stuff in there is insanely expensive. But one of the things that's in there, and Philip was with me when I went there on this particular occasion, they had a banjo that was in the case that we found it that they had. And this particular banjo is it's either a 1936 or a 1937 Gibson RB75. That may mean nothing to you, but it's a banjo that's almost 100 years old. Not only that, but this banjo used to belong to a man whose name is J.D. Crowe. J.D. Crowe is one of the best banjo players that's ever lived. I'm sure you have thought about him a lot and listened to his stuff all the time. I do. Anyway, but this banjo used to belong to J.D. Crowe, and it's in the case. And technically, it's not for sale. But Ed Lowe, the guy that owns the place, he got it out and let Philip play it and let me play it. And it was insanely cool to play this instrument. And he said, it's not for sale. And I said, well, I understand that. I said, but everything has its price. I said, what number would start to get you to pay attention? $225,000. $225,000. I know you're thinking, most banjo players have $2.25. So anyway, but $225,000. Imagine if you had enough disposable income, or you could buy a banjo that's worth roughly $250,000. If I had that, I would be afraid to ever touch the thing. Wouldn't you? I mean, even if you were the best banjo player ever, I'd be afraid to touch this thing. Because if I pick it up, what might happen? I might drop it. I might crack the resonator. I might break the neck off. I don't know. There's all kinds of things that could happen. It's a banjo. Somebody might throw something at it, right? All kinds of things could happen to this. I would be petrified of ever even opening the case. But beyond that, if I had that, I'd also want to keep it a secret, because if you had an instrument that's worth $250,000, would you want to advertise to the world, hey, look what I've got? No, because somebody might take it. And so if I had this thing that was so valuable, I would be so concerned about it, because I would realize at any point I could lose this thing. There's no way I could actually enjoy it, because it would always be subject to being lost in one form or fashion. There is something in your life that matters most. And whatever that is in a spot in your life that ultimately has God's name on that parking place. That is a reserved spot for Him. And it's entirely possible that maybe you have put something in there. Maybe it's not a banjo, but maybe it's your home. Maybe it's your phone. Maybe it's your investments. Maybe it's your car. I'm just telling you, it absolutely can happen where the stuff that matters most to us can be stuff. And when what ultimately matters to us is not God, when we put stuff in that place, we are subject to losing what matters most. That is a great and grave consequence. But there's another consequence that Jesus describes, and that's this. You develop inappropriate feelings. You develop inappropriate feelings. At the end of this, Jesus says, where your treasure is, there your heart will be also. This comes on the heels of what He has said back at the beginning in verse 19, where He says to not store up for yourselves treasures on earth. If there is something that you treasure, if there are things that you treasure, things that you deem valuable, material stuff in life, what do you tend to do with that? In truth, what we tend to do just by nature is we tend to invest more in it, don't we? We invest more time, we invest more attention, we invest more money in it. Let's say, for example, if baseball cards are your thing. There's nothing wrong with baseball cards, but let's say baseball cards are your thing. If you value those, if you place importance on those, if that is part of something that you, in some form or fashion, treasure, what do you tend to do? You spend more time looking at them. You spend more time looking for more of them. You are buying them, you are selling them, and over time, what happens to that investment? Both of time and money, and ultimately value to you. It grows over time. That which we treasure, we invest in, and as we invest in it, its value to us grows over time. If you are investing most, if your attention revolves around something ultimately other than God, your investment in whatever that is over time is going to continue to grow such that this happens. You will feel for something, you will feel about things in ways that you should not feel. Now, very easily what we can say is, well, there's nothing wrong with my feelings. This is how I feel. This is what I like. This is what I'm interested in. These are my feelings. And I just need to operate and allow my feelings to just be what they are. In fact, regularly we operate in a culture that tells us to do what? It tells us to follow our hearts. But understand this, the Bible tells us that our hearts are deceitful. They can play tricks on us. They can lead us down roads that we should not go down. They can lead us to experience, among other things, feelings that we should not possess. Regularly in life, it is the case that we can and do feel towards things that we should not feel about. Sometimes that can be people, but it can also be things. And Jesus is cautioning that if that which you value ultimately most is stuff
over time, what is going to occur is that your feeling towards those things is going to continue to grow. And you will have feelings towards stuff that, candidly, you shouldn't have. And throughout the whole of Scripture, I believe we have this admonition. It's not to follow your heart, but it's to guide your heart, to train your heart, to shepherd your heart. Now, in this particular case, Jesus says, where your treasure is, there your heart will be also. And it's possible you could read this and maybe somehow the Spirit of God would say to you, you know what, you're out of bounds in this area and you feel towards some stuff. Maybe it's towards your bank account, the sum total of your possessions, your 401k plan, your car, your home, your whatever it is, your boat, your beach house, your teeth, whatever it is. There is something that you ultimately value and you have been investing in this and it's continuing to grow. And maybe it is that God could convict you and say, you know what, how you feel about that is over the line. And you're giving this attention and you're giving this focus and you're giving this affection that ultimately, that's my spot. You've been putting that in my place in your life. And maybe you would see that and you say, you know what, yeah, that's right. And it shouldn't be that way. I've got a relationship with God. I've got a personal connection with Jesus. And so I need to be getting Him in the right spot. And so what I have is a heart problem. So I just need to say, okay, God, let's get this heart straightened out. And so God, just change my feelings, and then that will change where my treasure is. Change my feelings, and that'll change where my treasure is. I don't believe, while that seems logical, I don't believe that's what Jesus is describing here. The principle I believe that He's communicating is this: your heart follows your treasure. Your heart follows what you most value. If your heart has gotten out of bounds, trying to adjust the heart is like the tail wagging the dog. What you need to do is to start adjusting where the treasure is placed. Well, what do you mean? What do you mean by that? Do you just say, Michael? You said, I don't just change my feelings. No, you start changing where it is that you are investing. And as you do that, if it's time, if it's attention, if it's resources, if it's affection, as you do that, the more that you do these things, what will happen is that the feelings will begin to follow. And you say, well, I don't know. Because a lot of times what will happen is that we fall into a trap and we think, I just need to wait until my feelings change. And once my feelings change, then I'll start investing in the right ways and the right things, and ultimately giving God the attention that He deserves. But if you're waiting for the feelings to change, it's entirely possible that that time will never come. Think about what your life would look like. Think about what all of our lives would look like if we just did what we felt like. I didn't really feel like getting up at 6:10 this morning, but I had a 3-year-old that did. I feel like just eating peach milkshakes today, but I realize that's not really good. How many of you, you're off tomorrow, but come Tuesday morning, how many of you are going to feel like getting up out of the bed and going to work on Tuesday? Probably not going to feel like it. How many of you are going to feel like paying your mortgage this month? How many are going to feel like being nice to the DMV worker? If we only do, and if we only did the things that we feel like doing, if we only wait until our heart is in it, I'm telling you, what will happen is that those times will never come. What we need to do is we start doing the things that we know are right, and then what happens is that the feelings will catch up. And if I start investing in the right spot, and I start investing in the right things and say, all right, there is this part of me, that there is this reserved spot for God in my life, and I have been giving that to some stuff. There's material things that have crept into that, and so I don't want to be doing that. And so instead, what I want to start doing is to be giving my attention, to give my focus, to give my resources, His direction. Over time, what will happen, and it doesn't take much time, the feelings will begin to line up. And so where you're investing, where your treasure is, your heart, your feelings will be there also. Here's a simple question that I think in response we need to ask ourselves. How can we tell? How can you tell if this affects you? If you are somehow out of bounds in this area of your life? Let me ask you this. First of all, what does it look like? Because if you can't answer this, we're in trouble. What does it look like when God has the right place in a person's life? Well, what does it look like when God has His rightful place in a person's life? I mean, I think there's 1,000 different ways that we could specify and give a lot of detail to it, but I think we could agree on this, that when God has the right place, His rightful place in a person's life, their life and the sum total of it revolves around Him. Now, that doesn't mean that you're sitting around doing nothing but singing hymns, and every waking moment you're thinking a theological thought, and that all you do is recite Bible verses. No, but what I am saying is this. If God has the rightful place, His rightful place in your life, on a Tuesday afternoon, as you're looking at your checkbook, should it register to you, am I using the resources He's entrusted to my care the way He wanted me to? As I'm surfing the TV and trying to find something to watch, am I watching things that are, and I'm filling my mind with thoughts that are at odds with what He has said is good and true? As I'm having conversations with people, am I engaging them and talking to them in ways and responding in ways that God says are in bounds, or am I acting in ways that He said that's the cross the line? What I'm saying is that when God has His rightful place in a person's life, it affects the totality of their life. All right? So let me ask you this. How do you know if this affects you? If somehow, to some degree, you have been giving God's place to stuff in your life. All right? Think with me about it this way. If you were here last Sunday, or if you're a guest today, if you're watching online, if you last Sunday morning, or normally on a Sunday morning, you spend your time in a church worship service. Take Sunday out of the equation, all right? So that leaves us with Monday through Saturday. Of your thoughts on a Monday through Saturday, how many times did God even cross your mind? How many times did something from His Word ever cross your attention? Now, I realize we've got a stack of kids that just came back from camp, and so this past week was kind of unusual, but on a normal basis. Listen, if God has His rightful place in my life, is it not the case that I'm going to think more about Him than just on Sunday morning? It's entirely possible that what has occupied more of your thoughts this week has been the house, the car, the clothes, the phone, the TV, the stuff of life. And I'm telling you, if that's the case, you've been giving God's spot to something else. And if you have given God's spot to something else, what do you have? Candidly, you've got an idol. It's possible, even sitting here in a worship service, that you might have an idol in your heart because you've given His place to stuff. Maybe it's time that we give Him the spot that is rightfully His and was rightfully His all along. Will you bow your heads with me?